EJ Antoni, Heritage Foundation Public Finance Economist. EJ, great to see you. You know more about the minutia of these one bill, two bill things than anybody else, okay? It sounds like the president-elect wants one big, powerful, beautiful bill, but he's kind of sort of open to two. What do you think has to happen here?
Well, Brian, I think tax cuts have got to get across the finish line. That's probably first and foremost. Americans are really drowning right now under the hidden tax of inflation. The last thing they need is an explicit tax increase via having to pay more income taxes. This has to be a big priority. Voters made it a priority when they went to the polls in November. So, again, I think Congress really needs to make sure that that is in the first piece of legislation. Whether they get it all done in a single bill or not, look, it would be nice if they could. In a certain sense, it would be cleaner, as the president said, but it's also more complicated to try to get it all done at once. And sometimes you end up having to give up too much ground. In other words, in order to get people to vote for item A, you need to give up on item B. And so we kind of just have to wait and see, unfortunately, as to whether or not Mike Johnson's going to be able to corral all the cats he needs to in order to get it all done in a single piece of legislation.
And how do they do that with also another eye on deficits and debt?
Taylor, that's a great question here. So we have to remember, with reconciliation, you can't have a bill that is just going to explode the debt and deficit. And so anytime you do want to add something in terms of a piece of spending, you're going to need to cut spending elsewhere or raise taxes. And one of the big problems that we have right now with how these pieces of legislation are scored is the fact that they're typically not done dynamically. In other words, it doesn't take into account incentive effects. So when we reduce tax rates, for example, that spurs additional economic activity, which is why you can end up getting more tax revenue out of a lower tax rate. Exactly what we saw with the Trump tax reform. And so if you do not extend that, you will see higher tax rates, but probably less tax revenue. Unfortunately, though, when Congress goes through their scoring process for these bills, they typically will score a higher tax rate as higher tax revenue, even though historically that does not line up with the facts.
EJ, I want to switch gears and talk about President Biden for a moment, because in the 11th hour of his presidency, he's a lame duck, and he's trying to sign off on some things, or maybe he's not, but the powers that be are. One of them banning new oil and gas drilling in large parts of federal waters. It's a move that would be hard for Trump to reverse. It certainly is possible, but it's like he's just trying to make life more difficult because he knows what's coming down the pike. Is this to gain favor for the party in some way? Are they thinking about 2028 already, or is this just spiteful?
Oh, Jackie, it certainly seems very spiteful. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head when you said he's just trying to make life harder. That's kind of been the theme, I think, of the entire Biden administration, trying to make life harder. In that case, it was for the American people. Now he's just trying to make life harder for President Trump. Now, fortunately, even though you're right, it is going to be difficult to overturn some of these things, I would say the silver lining is the fact that typically anything done through executive action can be undone through executive action. Things that are done through regulation can also be undone through deregulation. Is it going to take some time? Absolutely. However, I think when we're dealing with the energy industry, you are dealing with a sector of the economy that focuses on things with a very long time horizon. In other words, they may still go ahead with plans despite these roadblocks that the Biden administration is throwing up, knowing that several years from now, they will be under a totally different energy regime, and they will be able to explore and to drill and to transport their materials.
EJ, I want to ask you about the labor market, if I could, for a second. You're great on this. You're always kind of digging below the headlines. We've got some new data that says more than 1.5 million workers have been unemployed for more than 6 months. So long-term unemployment has been going up. How big of an issue is that going to be for the incoming administration as they try to get the economy turned in the right direction when you've got this trend of longer-term unemployment?
Brian, it's a good question. I think this really helps explain part of the reason why we haven't seen the spike that we've been expecting in initial unemployment insurance or UI claims, despite the fact that continuing claims have continued to increase. In other words, the people who are initially filing, more and more of them are filtering through to continuing claims. So while we don't see the mass layoffs all at once, what we're seeing is a slow trickle of people losing their job and not being able to find new ones in a relatively short period of time, and that means they're now on the continuing claims rolls. I think another explanation for it is the fact that we've had such an influx in foreign-born workers. A lot of them are not eligible for UI, that once they do lose their job, they're not showing up in the numbers either. But to your question, how difficult is this going to be for the incoming administration? It's a big challenge. The labor market is much weaker than we've been led to believe. We're going to see a huge downward revision hit the tape in the January's report.
A perfect reason to juice growth in this economy. EJ Antoni, got to leave it there. Good to see you, sir.
You too.